Welcome to Promethean Actions weekly class for June 14th, 2025, with the author Robert Ingram, who has a great many titles on Amazon, especially featuring American history. Tonight, Bob's going to introduce us to the great American inventor, George Westinghouse. So without further ado, let me hand it over to Bob.
Hello, everyone. So the title of tonight's class, which many of you might have seen from the email we sent out, is the Illustrious George Westinghouse. And that is what we are going to be talking about. And the idea here is that my intention, at least, is that this is going to be a fun discussion. Fun, F-U-N. Look, there's a lot going on in the world right now. Very dangerous, very tumultuous. A lot of people are worried. You got the Israeli attacks on Iran. You've got the situation in the Ukraine. You just had two members of the Minnesota legislature who were attacked with assassination attempts, and one of them died. We've got these No Kings demonstrations, or what's really a No Kings uprising going on all over the country, and there are many, many other things, all of which, create a lot of angst, a lot of worry, a lot of distress in people's minds and in their hearts. So I thought it would be useful to take a break and to do something that will be somewhat enjoyable. Now, I said it's fun, but as we go along here, I think people will see that it's also informative fun, because there is a lot that is relevant to the situation we find ourselves in today. There is a lot that is applicable towards the way out of some of our problems. So, people should just follow along and see what we're doing. George Westinghouse is one of the greatest Americans who ever lived. Today he's virtually unknown. There was a time, even within the lifetime of probably quite a few people who are on this call, when the name Westinghouse was a household name. It was named by, it was a name known by everyone. Maybe not George Westinghouse as a person, but the name Westinghouse. If you go back to the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, the Westinghouse Corporation was the leading American producer of household appliances, of electronics. You could buy a Westinghouse refrigerator, a Westinghouse washing machine, a Westinghouse, television set, and on and on and on. In fact, they had a little phrase for it back then. It was an advertising jingle, probably dreamed up by someone on Madison Avenue, but they featured it in a lot of their advertising, which was, "You can be sure if it's Westinghouse." Now, that Westinghouse Corporation no longer exists. We won't go into the sad demise of it unless someone brings it up in the discussion period. But, Westinghouse is, no longer plays that role. It's no longer, the Westinghouse Corporation doesn't even exist anymore, except for one very important spinoff. And George Westinghouse is really an almost obscure figure for a lot of Americans. But, he was the person most responsible for ushering in the age of electricity, particularly through his great project at Niagara Falls. He was among all, maybe Elon Musk might be of this type, but, throughout, American history, he was without question, without even anyone close to him, the manufacturer, the industrialist who was most committed to scientific progress, technological innovation, as the way in which his companies were going to operate. He was also a close personal friend of William McKinley, and he was a bitter enemy of the financial trust, J.P. Morgan and the financial trust. Now, the Westinghouse and McKinley are similar in some ways. They're very similar in some ways. They have sort of a shared type of background. Westinghouse's father was a machinist, and he actually opened up a company in Schenectady, New York, which is where George Westinghouse was born. He opened up a company called Westinghouse and Company, and he was a very skilled and very prosperous machinist. McKinley's father owned an iron mill and an iron forge in Ohio. So they both came up through, both George Westinghouse and William McKinley, not only through working class families, but through industrial working class families with an industrial, technological, and manufacturing background. They also both came from families, the Westinghouse family and the McKinley family, which leading into the Civil War were strongly abolitionist. And both William McKinley and George Westinghouse enlisted in the U.S. Army as privates when the Civil War broke out. McKinley was 18 years old when he enlisted. Westinghouse was 17 years old. And in fact, it's sort of a funny story. In 1861, when the war broke out, that's when McKinley enlisted. But that same year, in 1861, George Westinghouse tried to enlist. He was only 15 years old, and he went down and tried to get enlist. And they called his father, and his father dragged him back home, wouldn't let him enlist. But 2 years later, in 1863, when Westinghouse turned 17, he did enlist, and he served through the war, just like McKinley. Another thing which they both had in common was that both men were deeply religious, and I mean deeply religious, and they lived their lives with an almost sacrosanct moral code as to their personal behavior, their political outlooks, and how, what they believed in. They became, as adults, they went in different directions. McKinley became a lawyer and then a politician, ran for office. Westinghouse became an inventor and then a manufacturer. But they had these shared commitments to progress, to industrial and scientific progress, which were really unshakable in both men. They also had a shared commitment to, whatever you want to call it, the general welfare, the betterment of the citizenry, to working Americans, a commitment to the interests and the concerns of working Americans, which really set Westinghouse off among a lot of these big corporate leaders in the late 19th century. And why don't you put up picture one and then picture two? First picture one. Gonna have a lot of pictures, folks. Like I said, it's gonna be fun. All right, so that's just a picture of Westinghouse later in life. I don't have much to say about him, just so you know sort of what he looked like in his mature years. And then put up picture two. And this is the town, not the town, this is the neighborhood that Westinghouse grew up in. You can see it's not exactly you know, uh, Beverly Hills. It's not exactly a rich man's town. That's not the house he grew up in, but this is sort of the street or the neighborhood he grew up in. Now, this picture was taken in the 1880s, so it probably was a little bit different when he was a boy. Like, for instance, you can see those are telegraph lines there. And I'm not sure those telegraph lines were there in the 1850s. They might have been. But, a working class family, a working class family background. That was what Westinghouse came out of. So you can take that down. So Westinghouse and McKinley came to know each other as adults. As Westinghouse became more successful and more important through his inventions, through his companies, and McKinley became increasingly a more important political figure in the United States Congress, they came to know each other. And what developed between them was a very, very close personal relationship. And it's sort of interesting that I've read a lot of biographies of McKinley. Some of them barely mention Westinghouse. Others, give him some, passing sort of acknowledgement. Um, but in looking, deeper into various sort of original source documents I could find, um, what is very apparent is that they had a very deep friendship for decades, for years and years. They were very close to each other personally. Um, the when they were discussing how to regulate the railroads and what to do about all of the accidents and fatalities on the railroads, McKinley, who was the head of the House Ways and Means Committee, invited Westinghouse in to testify. Later, when he was governor of Ohio, Westinghouse would visit him frequently. He formulated policy on dealing with the railroads in Ohio. They cooperated together on the YMCA. I told you they were both religious. McKinley was the head of the YMCA in Canton. Westinghouse became one of the big leaders of the YMCA in Pennsylvania. They cooperated together on that. When McKinley got elected, in 1896, when McKinley was running for president, and also George Westinghouse was a big supporter of McKinley's tariff policy. In 1896, when McKinley ran for president, Westinghouse became an elector for McKinley in the Electoral College, which is one of the very, very rare things he ever did politically. Westinghouse was not someone who was involved in politics. But in 1896, he became a presidential elector for William McKinley. When McKinley got into the White House, Westinghouse bought a home. Westinghouse never lived in Washington before then and didn't even visit Washington very often. But when McKinley got elected president, Westinghouse bought a house in Washington, D.C. And he was a frequent guest at the White House, both, for just, social events and personal meetings with McKinley, as well as an advisor to McKinley. So, they were very close, political allies and friends. Um, the um, the um, um, the Now, what I want to begin with on Westinghouse, before we get into his inventions and his industries, I want to begin with this question of the of really, you know, Westinghouse's very strong belief, and this did flow out of his religious and moral code, his belief of Westinghouse's really, he could not be moved from it. His strong belief in what was called at one time the harmony of interest between capital and labor. Um, this was a phrase that I believe was first used by Henry Carey. I'm not sure. The American economist, might have been his father who came up with the term. It was absolutely uh, a view that was, very strongly held by Abraham Lincoln, which is that class warfare had no place in America. That the idea that we were going to be permanently a nation of haves and have-nots, of the ultra wealthy and the poor, that for both McKinley, and certainly for Abraham Lincoln, but for McKinley and very much so for George Westinghouse, this was simply unacceptable. This was a violation of everything that the American Republic stood for, of the principles which founded this nation. And Lincoln used to talk about the right to rise, the right to advance. That in America there was an inherent commitment, moral, philosophical, political commitment of the government enacting policies which gave the people of the country the right to advance their condition, to rise, to become more, better living standards, more talented, more opportunities, but that we were not going to, degenerate into the, conditions that had existed for centuries in Europe, of an impoverished population ruled over by a bunch of elites and aristocrats. For Westinghouse, this was a lifelong commitment. And he eventually created 60 companies. He had 60 companies, some of which were very large, and he had tens and tens of thousands of employees. And he treated them in a way which all of the other corporate leaders hated, and which Wall Street and the financial elite hated. The way in which he handled his workforce. For instance, if you go back to the 1980s, at that time, the biggest employer in the United States was the Pennsylvania Railroad. They were the biggest employer in the 1880s. And they paid their workforce on average, the railroad workers and what have you, the blue collar workers, they paid them on average about $1 a day. That was sort of the average wage. Somewhat more skilled employees would get a little bit more. And that was also true in a lot of the factories in the country, where only the most skilled, the most highly skilled people working in these factories would get, maybe $2 a day. Westinghouse, in his various companies, the Westinghouse Air Brake Company, Westinghouse Electric, and all these other companies he owned, his starting wage was $4 a day. That was the starting wage, $4 a day. The Westinghouse factories had safety measures, they had increased lighting. Westinghouse factories had medical clinics in them. The big Westinghouse companies like the Air Brake Company and Westinghouse Electric had in-house schools, which were free for the workers, where foreign workers would learn how to speak English and read and write English, become literate in English. And he had more advanced classes, in engineering, in science, in mathematics. For those young employees, people who were 20, 22, 25 years old, who wanted to develop their skills, who wanted to become more advanced. Westinghouse had schools in his factories, free of charge, for his workers to participate in this. Again, if you go back to the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, almost all major manufacturing plants in the United States, and this includes the railroads too, not just the manufacturing plants, almost all blue collar employment was 12-hour work days. They worked 12-hour work days. Westinghouse was one of the first. I don't know if he was the first, but he was one of the first, certainly probably the first of the big companies to introduce the 8-hour workday, which he made universal through all of his various enterprises. And then he did something which really freaked everyone out, which is he introduced the 5.5-day work week, because the typical work week for back in the 1880s and 1890s was a 12-hour workday, 6 days a week. 12 hours, 6 days a week. Westinghouse introduced the 5.5-day work week, but where workers would work Monday through Friday 8 hours, and then on Saturday they would work 4 hours, but they would get paid for a full day on Saturday. So in other words, they would work 5.5 days, but get 6 days worth of wages. And this just freaked everybody out. He was denounced by Wall Street. He was denounced by Andrew Carnegie and others, that he was coddling his workers, that he was wasting money, and on and on and on. But the fact is that these, coddled, that year after year after year, these coddled workers working for Westinghouse were more productive, and that the productivity at the Westinghouse plants vastly outstripped productivity gains in other major manufacturers, steel, rubber, glass, you name it, just year after year, leaps in productivity, because what Westinghouse was doing, it was non-stop, and I literally mean non-stop introduction of new technologies, new inventions, new scientific breakthroughs, bringing these things onto the floor, integrating them into the production process. And then, of course, he was developing a skilled workforce, with knowledge in technologies, capable of bringing these things online and operating them. So there were these constant leaps in productivity in all of the Westinghouse factories. Westinghouse also introduced, again, free of charge, the companies paid for it, pension and disability funds for all of his employees. I mean, these were the kind of things he was doing. And there was a famous quote from Samuel Gompers, which some people might be familiar with. Samuel Gompers was the president of the American Federation of Labor, one of the major labor leaders in the United States. And he was quoted as saying that, quote, if all employers of men treated their employees with the same consideration Westinghouse does, the AFL would go out of business. Right? So that was the thing. Now, Westinghouse did one other thing, which is he wanted to sort of demonstrate that you didn't have to treat your workforce like animals. You didn't have to exploit your workers. You weren't trying to squeeze every last penny out of your workers in order to turn a profit. So one of the things he decided to do was to build a model city in a place called Wilmerding, Wilmerding, Pennsylvania. It's about 15 miles from Pittsburgh. Now you have to understand, I mean, some people here probably have read, Charles Dickens' depictions of, the industrial slums in London in the 19th century. But if you haven't, it's okay, because you have to understand that at that time, if you went to some of these big manufacturing centers like McKeesport and some of these others, around Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and elsewhere in Ohio, if you went to these cities where there were big manufacturing plants, these manufacturing plants were surrounded by the most wretched slums imaginable. Crime, prostitution, gambling, drunkenness, violence, and the living conditions for people there were beyond belief. It was like being in some fourth world city, almost like the homeless encampments you see today. I mean, it was unbelievable. People living in shacks or what passed as shacks, no running water, no sanitation, no lighting except for candles or maybe oil lamps. Absolutely wretched conditions. So Westinghouse built this model city. And what he did is he located his largest plant in this city. So this was not just some little, Potemkin village, little model city, off in the middle of nowhere. He built his largest manufacturing plant of the air and brake company, and then he built a city to surround it in this town in Wilmerding, and he built homes, and the homes all had running water, natural gas piped in, electricity brought in. They had Wilmerding had a hospital, a community hospital, a fire department, a library, schools, parks, a community center. And the idea was that, his employees deserved to live like human beings, not like animals. And why don't you put up slide number 3, Tony? No, next one. That's it. That's a picture of Wilmerding from, I think it says 1887. So that's pretty contemporary. You could see the big factory there, and then the town he built. Looks very nice, all laid out, trees, parks, what have you. Like I said, schools, fire department, all the homes. And these homes were available to the workers to either rent or buy at very modest prices. He was not trying to turn a profit on it. And in fact, he set up a system where a small percentage of the workers' weekly paycheck would go into pay for the purchase price of the home, which after a certain period of time, they would own outright. And this was unheard of. I mean, no other factory town in America had anything like this, nothing like it. So, all right, you could take that down. And then the final thing, just to show you his relationship with his employees. In 1876, there was the great Philadelphia Centennial to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And a lot of people on this call probably know something about the Philadelphia Centennial. It was, nothing like it had ever seen before. There were all these scientific displays. People were there, inventors, this, that, and the other thing. And, it was dazzling. And what Westinghouse did is he closed his factories for a week, and he hired private railroad cars, and he took all of his employees to Philadelphia for a week at the Centennial, paid vacation. He paid their way there. He paid their way back. He paid for the housing, and he gave them a full week's wages. And all of his employees spent a week at the Philadelphia Centennial. So that's the kind of boss that George Westinghouse was. And I think a lot of people wish that in the jobs they've had throughout their lives, they wish they had a boss like George Westinghouse. So, all right, to move on, you know, the question arises, who was the greatest inventor, Westinghouse or Edison? And there are partisans. I mean, the average person would say Edison because, today, like I said, a lot of people know something about Edison. He invented the light bulb, he invented the phonograph, blah, blah, blah. He invented these things. And almost no one knows anything about Westinghouse. But for people who know a little bit more, there is a difference of opinion. I'm not going to try to tell you who was the greatest inventor. I mean, I think Westinghouse was at least Edison's equal as a scientific inventor. He never stopped inventing, never, throughout his life. He had 360 patents that he filed during his life. And again, some people would point to Edison because Edison had over 1,000 patents. But I will make a point here, which is true, which is that Westinghouse never patented anything that he did not invent. Now, he used a lot of patents from other people, many patents from other people in his factories, but he paid them for them. He either bought the patents or leased the patents, and the patents always remained in the name of the original inventor. Westinghouse never claimed any of these patents as his patents. Now, Edison, on the other hand, if you worked for Edison, in Menlo Park or anywhere else, if you were, Edison Electric, and if you invented something, you were required to file that patent under Edison's name. And Edison became legally the holder of the patent, the inventor of whatever was invented, and the owner of the patent to use as you see fit. And that's the way Edison operated. That was one of the reasons why later Nikolai Tesla broke with Edison, because Edison demanded that Tesla turn over all his patents to Edison, and Tesla refused, and he went to Westinghouse, and Westinghouse bought his patents for $1 million, which Tesla was very happy about. But the fact is, Westinghouse, without getting into an Edison Westinghouse controversy, Westinghouse never stopped inventing. He filed his first patent when he was 20 years old. It was which he never really used, but it was a patent for a rotary steam engine, which he developed while he was still in the Army. Well, actually, he was in the Navy because he got transferred to the Navy. But he, when he was still in the Navy during the Civil War, he developed what was called a rotary steam engine, and he filed a patent for that. Then 1 year after that, right after the Civil War, he filed his second patent, which was for what he called a car replacer. And this was a device. Railroad cars derailed all the time. I mean, all the time in the 19th century. It was an everyday occurrence. And it was very hard to get the railroad cars or the locomotive engine back on the tracks. He developed a device to do that, which he patented. And this actually was bought and was used by a lot of railroads. But then in 1867, and Westinghouse is only 23 years old here, in 1867, he began to work on his air brakes for railroad cars. And this is what made his name. This is what put Edison on the map, or Westinghouse on the map. Now, for those who are not familiar with this, in the 19th century, braking railroad trains, railroads coming down the track, choo, 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 braking the train, bringing the train to a stop was an enormous problem. and very difficult to do. And and this existed all during the Civil War, et cetera. And what they had on all of the railroad trains, passenger and freight, were manual handbrakes, where the brakeman, on the train, there was a wheel on every car. Each car had its individual brake, handbrake, and a brakeman had to turn the wheel, which lowered a metal plate onto the train wheels, and that was the brake. You applied the brake manually, and this had to be done on each car. Each car had to be, it had to be braked, individually. Now, this was particularly, on passenger trains, at least, the brake was, between the cars, so you could stand there and do it. But on freight trains, this was particularly insane because this wheel to apply the brake manually was at the top of the train. It was on it was on top of the cars, and each car had its own wheel. And what these brakemen had to do, and the train is moving here, could be moving relatively fast. And what the brakeman had to do was turn one wheel, apply the brake, run down the length of the car, jump to the next car, turn that wheel, run down the length of that car, jump to the next car, and turn that wheel. And it could be snowing, it could be raining, it could be sleeting, God knows, and the conditions that they were operating under. Brakemen got killed by the hundreds, in the decades, from the 1850s into the 1880s. Hundreds of brakemen got killed doing this. And one thing is, since you're applying the brake on each car individually, if you apply the brake on one car and it starts to slow down, the cars behind it are still going full speed. So they all slammed into each other. And plus there was a question of whether you're going to be able to brake in time anyway to stop the train. Collisions and derailments were a commonplace occurrence. And what Westinghouse decided was he was going to figure out a way to brake trains uniformly and safely and smoothly. So he began working on this. And the first thing he did is he tried to develop a system where there would be a chain link between all the cars. And he worked on that for a while and then abandoned it because, it just wasn't going to work. So then he tried to work on using a little steam engine and to run steam piping through the cars, because Westinghouse knew a lot about steam energy and steam engines. He tried to use steam, and he worked on that for months, and he finally decided that wasn't going to work either. So then he came up with the idea of using compressed air. That he would have a device in the engine, which would there would be a tube of air, which the engineer could, using this device in the engine, could raise or lower the pressure of the compressed air, and based on whether the compressed air was being lowered or raised, this then could apply brakes simultaneously on all of the trains, and it worked. He later improved it, which I'm not going to go into. But he came up with a system that worked, and in 1869 he patented his air brake, which he invented, and founded the Westinghouse Air Brake Company. So let's look through a few slides here, Tony. Number 4. Is that number 4? I guess so. What it says is there, I guess this is true, the first locomotive equipped by George Westinghouse with compressed air power brakes for regular road service. So I guess that's the train, 1869. Go to the next slide. Now, this is just sort of a diagram or I don't know, it's not a blueprint, but it's, whatever the correct term is, it for how this all worked. And, I think this is a drawing by Westinghouse, but somebody of how the air brake system works. I'm not going to try to explain it. I just thought I'd put it up so you get a sense of how this thing functioned. The next one. Now, for those who are not familiar with air brakes, you see there, forget the chain, forget the coupler on top. At the bottom, you see these two hoses hooked together. Those are the brakes. Those are the air brakes. There is compressed air which is flowing through those two hoses. And that is still how trains are braked today. Now, they've been improved, modernized. I mean, we're in the 21st century, so the things are more advanced than they used to be. But essentially, the Westinghouse air brake system, which he developed in 1869, is still the system used to brake trains today. Go to the next one. And that's his first Westinghouse air brake factory. Now, this is what made, you could take that down. This is what made Westinghouse's name. This is what made his fortune. And then he moved on from there. Now, there's a lot that can be said about his battle to get this implemented, because he was strongly opposed by Wall Street, strongly opposed by the other railroad companies, all of the major railroad companies. They didn't want to do it. They didn't want to purchase these air brakes from him, mostly because they didn't want to make the capital investment to do it. And they really didn't care if brakemen were getting killed like flies and trains were crashing into each other. They simply didn't want to spend the money to bring in Westinghouse's system. But eventually he prevailed, and eventually not only were his air brakes adopted uniformly in all of the American railroads, but then they were adopted in Europe. And Westinghouse actually opened up factories in England, in Belgium, in Italy, in Russia, to produce his air brakes, in Europe. And actually that made Westinghouse the first, international industrialist. I don't think you'd call him the first multinational corporation, but, an industrialist with factories, in various parts of the globe. And by 1890, not only was the air brake company functioning, but by 1890, Westinghouse air brakes were the largest machine tool shop, the largest machine shop in the United States, and I believe in the world. Now, we're going to move on from there because we got to keep moving along here. By the late 1870s and the early 1880s, Westinghouse began to investigate two other things. One was natural gas, and the other was electricity. Now, the natural gas, he did a lot on natural gas, a lot of important things, but I'm going to skip it all tonight and really focus on electricity. Now, Edison had introduced his electric light bulb in 1879, the Edison light bulb. But, there was a real problem with, the light bulb worked fine. But there was a real problem with making electricity usable, throughout the economy, throughout urban and other environments, in industry and in homes. Because as a lot of people know, Westinghouse based his system on direct current, which, direct current only.
Edison based it on direct current.
Yeah, Edison based it on direct current. And, I'm not a scientist or an engineer, but in my understanding, direct current can only be transmitted so far before it sort of peters out and it just doesn't work. And if you want to have a neighborhood or a section of a city powered by direct current, you need direct current transmitters every so often, fairly close to each other, for it to work. But it cannot be transmitted over a long distance. So what Westinghouse began to investigate was alternating current. And what happened is that a friend of his who was in Europe sent him a pamphlet that had been written by an Englishman named Gibbs and a Frenchman named Galliard, where in this pamphlet, these two individuals describe something they had been working on, which they called a secondary generator or a transformer. Now, they had not actually built this, and it didn't, there was no demonstrable model, but they described the theory behind it. And so they sent this, this friend of Westinghouse sent this pamphlet to him, and he began, he became intrigued by it, and he began working on it. And they did have a design of their transformer in this pamphlet. And Westinghouse recognized fairly early that the design wasn't going to work, that it was flawed. But he was mostly intrigued by the principle of what they had described, of generating alternating current. And so what he did is he set about using their concept to design his own transformer, which he did. And this, again, like the air brake, this was invented solely by Westinghouse, right? He worked on it for a number of months, and he came up with it, and then he decided to test it. And the first place he tested it was in a town called Lawrenceville, Massachusetts, where they were able to transmit electric current over a span of 4 miles in this test. 9 months later, they had a much bigger test, which was Buffalo, New York, where they transmitted electric light and power on a commercial scale. The Lawrenceville test was just small, but in Buffalo, they built a number of transformers, and they transferred electricity on a commercial scale into Buffalo, lighting up whole sections of the city and powering other things. So it was a sort of a proof of principle that this could be done on a large commercial scale. But at that point, he ran into a problem. What he had developed up to that point worked, but he was aware that there were inefficiencies in it, that the way in which the alternating current was being produced, was not optimized. It didn't function quite right. And that is what brought him into his relationship with Nikola Tesla. Because Tesla, Westinghouse had patented his alternating current transformer, and Tesla had gotten a copy of the patent, and working off of Westinghouse's patent, Tesla began to redesign it, really he developed almost a new transformer. I mean, it was based on what Westinghouse had done, but it was, different. And Westinghouse solved the problem. And let me just pause here for a second. I just want to say that in the course of the discussion, which we'll get to, Please do not ask me a lot of really technical scientific questions because I can't answer them. I just don't have the scientific background to do it. Maybe if my car or someone else is on, they can answer them. But anyway, to my understanding, Tesla developed a new a transformer based on what he called a rotating magnetic field, whatever that is. And then he also introduced what he called the polyphase principle, which was in which he utilized, what he did was he utilized two different alternating currents, which he fed in simultaneously, each in a different phase. And I really don't know anything about electrical phases. But anyway, as a result of Tesla's design, Westinghouse's transformer was transformed into something which really worked flawlessly. Westinghouse flew to New York City, met with Tesla, bought all of his patents, paid him $1 million. What's that? Bought all of his patents. Oh, he didn't fly to New York City. Excuse me. Airplanes came later. He traveled to New York City, bought all of Tesla's patents, and they sort of went into somewhat of a partnership. Now, the next thing was the Chicago Exposition, which I've talked about before, but this was the proof of principle. The Chicago Exposition, in 1893 was the end of the current war between, the battle of the currents between Edison and Westinghouse. At Chicago, Westinghouse won the battle of the currents. But this really was the beginning. This was the announcement of the age of electricity. What they did was they built huge transformers. They lit up the whole fair, the whole exposition. They powered all of the machines in the exposition. The people who went there were dazzled by it. To give you some example, I'll tell you now. To give you an example, the whole exposition was lit up, and the lighting for the Chicago Exposition used 25% of all of the electric light bulbs that then existed in the world. A quarter of all of the light bulbs in existence were used by Westinghouse in the Chicago Exposition. Tens of millions of people saw this. In 1893, the population of the United States was 65 million people. 28 million people visited the Chicago Exposition. 28 million visitors with a U.S. population of only 65 million. So why don't we put up the next 4 or 5 slides, Tony? And I'll try to run through the rest of this. Well, that's just an advertisement by the Westinghouse Electric Company for their alternating current system. You can put up the next one. This is a sort of a poster inviting people to come to the World Columbian Exposition in Chicago, 1893. And you can see in the bottom left there, the little picture of Christopher Columbus, because this exposition was the 500th anniversary of Columbus's voyage to the New World, Columbus's discovery of America. The next one. This is a picture of the Chicago Columbian Exposition. This is just a small portion of it. It was gigantic. The next one, this is sort of a picture of it, similar picture from a different angle, but the same area. But this is at nighttime. You see all the bright lights, dazzling lights. I'll also tell you, Westinghouse, what happened is Westinghouse got the contract to do this. And they were only, I don't know, a month or two away from, installing all of their equipment and installing all their lights. And Edison, well, actually, at that point, GE had been taken over by JP Morgan. So I don't know if it was Edison, but General Electric refused to let Westinghouse use their light bulbs because they were patented. And they refused to let Westinghouse use their light bulbs, which were the only light bulbs in existence. So Westinghouse had to invent new light bulbs. So in a period of just a few weeks, they invented a brand new light bulb and manufactured millions of them to install them at this exposition. And this is what it looked at night. The next one, that's a picture of some of the machines which were powering everything at the fair. Next one. That's the entrance to their exhibit, in Electricity Hall, the Westinghouse Electric Manufacturing Company, Tesla polyphase system. Next one. And this is interesting. This is in Electric Hall. This is the Westinghouse exhibit. And you see there's one guy up there. And this one guy is controlling all of the lights in the whole fairground, in the whole exposition. He's got a machine there where he's manipulating the flow of electricity to everything. And the fairgoers were amazed that one person could do this, The next one. And this is just, I showed this in a previous class. The statue, well, this is a reproduction of it. The original doesn't exist. The statue of Benjamin Franklin with his kite, which stood right outside of Electricity Hall, where the Westinghouse exhibit was. So everyone going into Electricity Hall would walk by this statue of Benjamin Franklin. All right, you could take that down. So right after Chicago, came the Niagara Falls project. And I mean, I don't know what you would compare this to. Otherwise, man landing on the moon or something. I don't know. Some people probably would have a good analogy. One doesn't come to mind. But you have to realize what this was. Again, there was a competition, and Westinghouse, really because of what he had done in Chicago. I mean, the Chicago Exposition and the Westinghouse exhibit at Chicago just blew everyone's minds, and so Westinghouse ended up being awarded the contract to harness electricity at Niagara Falls. And he did this, and they used the Tesla transformers, the Tesla generators. They initially built 3 of them. They were told that they had a deadline. They would lose the contract if they did not get the first transformer installed within 24 months. And they got it installed in 18 months. And then they built 2 more. They opened it with 3 transformers. Later, they added 7 more transformers to bring the total to 10. These were the most powerful generators in the world. They completed the project in under 2 years. With all 7 transformers involved, they were producing 50,000 horsepower of energy. the you know, and you know, almost immediately, the entire city of Buffalo and all of the surrounding areas, you know, in western and upstate New York, were electrified. And this essentially ushered in the electrification of America, which proceeded fairly rapidly from that point, except in, you know, real rural areas. But it proceeded fairly rapidly. By 1905, 25% of the electricity in America was being generated by hydroelectric power, all using, you know, the Westinghouse Tesla transformers and generators. But, you know, this literally ushered in a new world in terms of the power, you know, that it put at the fingertips of the human species, the power to transform, the power to build, the power to create. And I'm going to read you a quote. In 1897, they had a big celebration, you know, at Niagara Falls, to celebrate you know, what they had done, the completion of the project. They had a big celebration. There were hundreds and hundreds of people there, governors, elected officials, scientists, corporate people. You know, it was a real big thing. And they invited Tesla to give the keynote speech. I don't think Westinghouse was attended it. I'm not sure, but Tesla was invited to give the keynote speech. And I want to read you just a short excerpt from his speech, because, you know, I think it sort of encapsulates the kind of thinking of what this project really meant. And what Tesla said was the following: among all these many departments of research, there is one which is of the greatest significance for the comfort and existence of mankind, and that is the electrical transmission of power. We have many a monument of past ages exemplifying the greatness of nations, the power of men, the love of art, and religious devotion. But that monument at Niagara has something of its own, worthy of the scientific age, a true monument of enlightenment and of peace. It signifies the subjugation of natural forces to the service of man, the discontinuance of barbarous methods, the relieving of millions from want and suffering. Power is our mainstay, the primary source of our many-sided energies. And then I got 4 more slides here, Tony. Well, those are the generators in the Niagara plant. Go on. This is a plaque that was installed, you know, at Niagara Falls, you know, manufactured for the Niagara Falls Power Company by Westinghouse Electric, and then it lists the patents by name, and there's 13 of them, I believe, and as you can see, 9 of them are by Tesla, and the other 4 are by other individuals who I am not familiar with. This plaque was installed in 1899. Next one. And this is a statue of Tesla overlooking Niagara Falls. You know, you can get a picture of it from the front, but then you don't see the falls. So I thought this was a very nice picture. Taming Niagara Falls for the service of humanity. And then the next one, if there is another one. Oh yeah, well, this is a little picture. This is, I don't know if this is before or after they built the Niagara Falls project, but you see in the lower left-hand corner, there's two people, and they're obviously at Niagara Falls, and that's George Westinghouse and his wife. Okay, you could take that down. Now, here's the question. Um, the I have one more section to go, which involves Westinghouse's battle with Wall Street and with the trusts. But it's already almost 10 after 5. So I think really it would be better to, because he was the enemy of Wall Street, and they spent decades attempting to destroy him, destroy Westinghouse. But I think, we'll let that come up in the question and answer period. So I think I will, close there. But I do want to put up the final slide. This is a quote from Westinghouse. Short quote. Now, I don't know when he said it, but it is from Westinghouse. He says, "If someday they say of me that in my work I have contributed something to the welfare and happiness of my fellow man, I shall be satisfied." And so I think that says a lot about him. And I think that stands in stark contrast to a lot of the private equity, hedge fund, corporate, elite we have in our present day. So as I said, a little bit of fun. You can draw some useful lessons from this, I think. But why don't we stop and open it up for discussion?
Right. It's beautiful talk.